just zoom in on the bus.
Hello, handsome. This is American Government, Wednesday, November 10th. I passed out a packet of notes which includes both Monday notes. You can put your phone away now. And the rest of us can put our phone away too.
You sound like you're a little sassy this morning.
No. But I would say that 3 months into the semester, it should be pretty clear that by the time we start class, you should turn off your phones. That's just an issue with young people today.
Don't start.
No, they just don't.
You know an issue with old people? They be barking.
Some old people.
Some old people bark.
Old senile people. So I put Monday's notes on that we got partially through, and then today's notes, and then Friday's notes too. Plus an extra piece of blank paper that just meant one more tree was dead. So here's where we were on Monday. Partially a continuation of the theme of historical growth. That is to say, the growth of the presidency. And as I pointed out, there are sort of three senses in which the presidency has grown. It's grown institutionally in size. That question, by the way, we'll come back to on Friday when we turn to chapter 11 of the Wilson text and talk about the bureaucracy. So if you're looking at the notes, they include both Monday, and we'll begin with my walking you through the great 1936 court case of U.S. v. Curtis Wright. Then we'll continue with the notes for today, which if you are following along, you can see there's a big line that divides Monday from Wednesday on page 4. And remember the overall way of proceeding here with both Congress, the Electoral College, political parties, the presidency, and last, the judiciary is original design and intentions or functions, historical changes, and that's what we're in the middle of. And then in each of these institutions, I take you through the contemporary criticisms and questions that people have about the presidency. And so that's technically the material for today, so we'll begin that. And we'll continue then with our exploration of the presidency and the executive branch by looking at the rest of the executive branch, which is typically called the bureaucracy. And that's the material for Friday. And if you'll note, in addition to the notes, I've given you a remarkable diagram, the chartograph of the executive branch and the bureaucracy.
I love when we get chartographs.
And well, you got one today, or on Friday, I should say. And in addition to the chartograph and the extra blank page that killed a tree, is the GS schedule. We're going to talk about the way that the pyramid of the executive branch is structured. How many of you have any parents? Do you have any parents?
I don't have parents, actually.
So you sprang fully blown out of the earth.
Yeah, they sent me to the lab.
Together with those horns, too, right? And the tail. Do you have any parents that work for the government?
Nope.
The federal government? Any relatives?
Does the airlines?
No. The airlines are private companies. Unless you're talking about the FAA. Okay.
I think they work. She's like a social services person who works with like the police and other people. So like, I don't know.
On what level of government?
Like, I don't know. I didn't ask.
How about, do you have any relatives or friends in the military?
Oh, yeah, I do have that.
Okay, so strictly we'll be discussing them. My mother, when my father died in 1975, after I'd been married for 6 months, my dad was a veteran. He served in the Navy in World War II. And when my mom died, she died as the widow of a veteran. That meant that when she took the civil service exam, because there was a major military installation in the Quad Cities where I grew up in Illinois, Rock Island, Moline, Illinois, East Moline, Illinois, Davenport, Iowa. It's right on I-80 as you cross the Mississippi. Right in the middle of the Mississippi is an island. And that island is called the Arsenal. It goes back to the Civil War, actually a little beyond. During the Civil War, it was a major arms factory and a major southern prison camp. Prisoner Southern Camp. After the Civil War, it remained a military institute, and it became one of the major sources of manufacture of weapons and arms in the United States. So when my father passed away, my mother took the civil service exam. The civil service exam is part of the civil service system, and that's one of the things we'll talk about. What is the civil service system? And you'll see that the civil service system ranks every job in the federal government with respect to both function and salary. And when my mom was hired as a clerk accountant in the Department of Defense, she was a GS5. So we'll explore what that means. And you'll see that even though this is the federal government, and I'll walk you through this whole chartograph on Friday, nevertheless, most state governments actually imitate this. So if any of you have any relatives or friends that work for the state government, for the state of South Carolina or anything like that, they also have a parallel system of civil service like this. So we'll examine why that came into being and what the controversies and the questions are with respect to the bureaucracy. So if you would turn back to page 2. So we're in the middle of discussing the historical changes in the presidency and especially the growth of the presidency. As I said, I talked about 3 kinds of growth. The growth in the size and scope of the institution from about 50 to 500 people if you count the soldiers in the original Continental Army, plus George Washington and John Adams and a few other executive officers, to an institution now, and that's what's portrayed in the chartograph, over 1.5 to now 2 million people. The size and scope of the federal government goes up a little down from time to time, but you're really talking about a massive institution. So the other sense in which I argued the presidency had grown was not only in terms of scope and function because of the executive branch, because of national media, but especially power in the constitutional system. And here's where I want to begin. That in some ways we now have a presidency-centered constitutional system. And if you remember when I talked about the original intention, the person that we looked at, and that was true of Hamilton today in class, Hamilton clearly thought that the presidency would become the focus of the political system. There were other founders who did not want that and did not anticipate that. Yet, especially in foreign affairs, Hamilton's vision has won out. And what I want to walk you through is the most important court case about the president's role in foreign affairs that confirms how the president is at the center of foreign policy and in some ways the whole constitutional system. And that court case, if you're following along on page 2, was U.S. v. Curtis Wright in 1936. Curtis Wright it still exists, by the way, the company. It's on I-85. As you go to Charlotte, you see it on the right. Curtis Wright now manufactures things like thermostats and other kinds of domestic and some military equipment. But then in 1936, it was a major arms manufacturer. And so here's what you need to know to understand the issues in this case and what the court decided and how it confirms the centrality of the presidency in foreign affairs. And let me just say one thing that I add, the last lines of my Hamilton class today, because it's relevant to this. Because we were talking about Hamilton's view of the presidency, because that course is on Alexander Hamilton. And basically, I outlined the 2 theories of the presidency that Madison and Hamilton that I talked about in last week and in my recorded lecture over the weekend. But I want to make a point. You're going to see Hamilton thought the presidency would be, and should be very broad, flexible, and expansive. But that doesn't mean that Hamilton thought the president should be a dictator and that the president should be able to do whatever he wanted. Hamilton still thought the president's powers and actions had to be rooted in the Constitution. But how flexible that constitutional role is, that's what we're examining right now. So, first, in 1936, now this actually isn't just 1936, this is an important aspect of constitutional doctrine called the non-delegability of legislative power. This has to do with the doctrine of the separation of powers, because if you think about it, there are 2 dimensions to the separation of powers. One is that the powers and functions of government are divisible into 3 broad categories. There's something called legislative power, and as you know from like 5th grade or 8th grade, actually my niece at Charlotte Prep, who's in 4th grade right now, in her social studies class, just went over the 3 powers of government. So what's the legislative power? The power to do what?
Make laws.
What's the executive power?
Enforce laws.
And the judicial power?
Bring justice.
What were you going to say, Tiffany? Yeah, what do they do there?
Make sure people follow
Yeah, they make sure that people charged with speeding and who get $340 tickets slapped against them don't have to go to jail. We put a general term on that called interpreting the law. So, okay, so there are three broad the functions of government are divisible into three broad categories. The second dimension of the separation of powers is that it creates three separate institutions to embody those powers. And that's what, if you remember from our review of the Constitution, Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3 are setting up just not the three powers of government, but the three branches that own those powers. You may or may not remember our discussion of the vesting clauses and what a vested right or a vested power is. If it's vested, it means it's an inherent part of you. Now, if it's an inherent part of you, that means two things, one of which we don't typically think about, one of which we do think about. The phone that you just put away, Sophia. Now, I'm the professor in this class, and in that sense, in these walls right now, even though this is being recorded for posterity, I am, in fact, an absolute dictator. Yes, and whatever I say goes. If I tell Sydney to jump out that window, clearly the decibel level in class will go down. But don't do it. Life is worth so much more. So didn't I just tell you to put your phone away? What if so hand me your phone. I'm going to confiscate it.
Okay. Fake confiscate.
And I'm not giving it back. This is my phone now.
So that's your best friend in the back, Francis?
How did you get Dr. Dunn's picture on there?
Oh.
Now, I'm making a point here. Sophia just handed me her phone, which shows that I'm fat and she's a fool.
How does that first one we do?
All right, thank you. I didn't need to point that out. The camera shows everything. Now, of course.
It adds 10 pounds, right? The camera.
Well, and I already added 20 pounds this morning. My car's beginning to tip. Anyway, so that's what I should have claimed when I got charged with speeding, is that it was inertia. I couldn't slow down because there was so much body weight in the front.
When did you get charged for speeding?
Last Monday.
Were you here for that?
No, I think she was ill. Anyway, so, but the truth of the matter is, you wouldn't let me have your phone.
No, I get it back at the end of class.
Because why?
Because class is over, your dictatorship is over. 12:50, your dictatorship comes to an end.
My point that I'm making is, it's yours. If something belongs to you by right and by law, and that means somebody can't take it away from you. If somebody takes it away from you, unless you give it to them, by the way, what's that called?
Wait.
If somebody takes away a piece of your property without paying you for it, what's that?
Stealing.
It's stealing. So on one level, the vesting clauses and the Article 1, Section 1 and 2 and 3 means the other two branches of government can't take away the powers of the other branches. That's almost like stealing. Does that make sense? Now, the doctrine I'm trying to explain to you is a little bit different from property, because foolish Sophia, when I told her to give me her phone, she gave me her phone. But on the one hand, if I said, okay, Sophia, and this actually goes back to the Declaration of Independence, would you please give me your liver?
Dang.
How about your heart?
No.
Now, I might persuade you to clip off your fingernails and give me those, but that wouldn't be too much, as they say, skin off your back.
Are you talking? So let's just not do it.
Yeah, but the reason, of course, I'm getting to the concept of inalienable. Like when the Declaration says we have certain rights that are inalienable, not only can you not take them away from other people, but strictly speaking, if they are an unavoidable, an inalienable part of you, not only can people not take them away from you, but what? You can't give them away. There are certain parts of your rights. We had this long discussion in Alexander Hamilton today about the vaccine mandates.
Let's have a discussion about them now.
But let me just say that one of the questions was, because the student sitting right where you are, Sophia, said, doesn't the vaccine mandate take away people's freedom?
No.
But here's my response. Don't all laws take away personal freedom?
Yes, but they take away personal freedom to keep others safe.
Okay, that just means there are good reasons to limit people's freedom, right? And the doctrine of inalienable rights means the government may take away some of your freedoms to protect society, right? But for instance, can the government tell you what religion to believe in?
No.
Not only is that part of the First Amendment, but it's considered like speech and freedom and other things. There are certain parts of your nature that can't be, you can't give them away, because if you give away certain parts of your rights, what have you actually given up according to the Declaration? You're a very human being.
Yes.
And so in some ways, why is that relevant to this question of the non-delegability of legislative authority? The separation of powers in the vesting clause, when it says the legislative power shall be vested in a Congress and an executive power in a president and the judicial power in a judiciary, not only does it mean that the president in the exercise of his powers and the judiciary in the exercise of its powers, it can't take away the legislative powers of the Congress, because what does the Constitution say who owns those powers?
Congress.
And therefore would be like theft. But in the same way that you can't give away certain of your inalienable rights, the other meaning of the vesting clauses is one branch can't give up its essential power to the other branches. In other words, what's the only branch, according to the Constitution, that can actually exercise legislative authority?
Congress.
And that's where the doctrine of non-delegability of legislative authority is. It means, first of all, we know that Congress can pass laws. And you'll see part of the historical context of this was the Depression. What was the Depression?
The Great Depression?
Yeah, what was that?
Everything failed. Like, our economic system crashed.
At the height, 1932 to 1937, it was estimated, even though the paper unemployment rate was only about 20 to 21%, it was estimated that 30% of the American workforce had no income, was out of work, was unemployed. Now, you understand, that's like a natural disaster. 30% of the American people had no income. That would be like a hurricane or a tornado wiping away 30. So in some ways, it was one of the greatest emergencies that the country ever faced. Now, we won't talk about the causes of the Depression, but what I want to make you aware of is the New Deal. Who was the president when the Depression unfolded in 1929? Herbert Hoover. And even though he tried to start several programs to address it, clearly the reason that he was voted out of office and the reason that FDR was voted in is FDR promised a massive and flexible response to the Depression. Now, as you're going to see, the Supreme Court, and this became part of the issue that led to what was called court packing. We'll come back to that when we discuss the judiciary. Congress passed several laws that almost came down to this. We have a crisis. Here, President, do something. Now, as you're going to see, the court invalidated a good deal of New Deal legislation on the grounds that it gave too much authority to the president. Meaning, what the Congress did in passing certain laws was, it would be as if I wrote a check without any amount and gave it to you, Tiffany, and I said, here. That's called a blank check. What's the problem with a blank check? It's more a problem for me than it is for you.
You can write whatever.
In other words, I give you money, right? But I actually don't say how much money. And you could write whatever you wanted in it. I'd be sorely disappointed when you went to cash it. But my point is this. The doctrine that Congress can't give away its lawmaking power, even if it has the form of a law, it can't just say to the president, here, do something. And what the Supreme Court has decided is the Congress can pass a law, but the law has to have enough specific guidance in it that it actually constitutes a law. Otherwise, if you just say to the president, there's an economic crisis, here, do something, that's like writing the president a blank check, isn't it? Do you see my analogy? And so forth. This doctrine says whenever Congress passes a law and creates authority for the president, it has to have clear guidelines. It has to really be a real law that actually the president enforces and doesn't act on his own. That's the doctrine of the non-delegability. So let me sum it up. According to this doctrine, the Supreme Court says Congress, when it passes a law and gives authority to the president, it can't just be blank. It has to have guidance that guides the president's executive power. Does everyone understand that?
Yes.
With that in mind, here are the background and the facts of the case. In 1932 and 33, a civil war erupted in Bolivia, which is a country in what continent?
South America.
South America. And it was very divisive in American politics, almost like like certain aspects of domestic policy and foreign policy are divisive now. The Congress passed a resolution, and here's what the resolution says. It shall be the policy of the United States to remain neutral in the civil war between the two segments of Bolivia. The president shall find ways of enforcing this neutrality, and anything that the president decides will have criminal penalties. So let me just, again, I'm summarizing. I'm going to assume you read the case.
Yeah.
But Congress passed a resolution that said we authorize the president to enforce neutrality in American policy. Does anyone understand that? So you could say, okay, Congress passed a law and it said the president can decide how to remain neutrality. So what FDR did subsequently is he issued an executive order that made selling arms to either party of the Civil War illegal. So Congress passed a resolution that said, we want to remain neutral. Here, President, you do it according to how you see fit. Subsequently, FDR issued an executive order that did just that. He issued an executive order that made it a criminal offense to sell arms to either party in the Bolivian Civil War. Is that clear? So the reason this case is called U.S. v. Curtis Wright is Curtis Wright, who was an arms manufacturer, ignored President FDR's order and sold arms to the rebels. Therefore, the United States then brought criminal charges and a suit against Curtis Wright, charging them with violating the presidential executive order. Is that clear?
Mm-hmm. Sorry.
Okay, that's all right. Actually, I have to tell you, I just read a long article in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend on yawning. And it has a clip from a professor at Cornell yelling at his students because he was lecturing to 200 students and they were all yawning. And at one point he says, if there's one more person that yawns in this class, they fail. But the article suggests that when you yawn, your brain is actually craving stimulation and more oxygen because it's interested in something. So the more you yawn, the more you declare your fascination with this material.
Sorry.
I know. Bless your hearts, as they say it in here, in exactly the way they mean it down here. So, Curtis Wright lost the case. For your information, when we come to the judiciary in the Supreme Court, whenever a Supreme Court case, you know what a plaintiff and a defendant is?
Yes.
What's a plaintiff?
Is the person trying to charge the other person?
Yeah, in criminal cases, it's the government. In civil cases, if I back out of my driveway and run over your cat and you sue me,
oh, I'll be pissed.
It's Miller versus Pavotti. Because I killed your cat, and it turns out we were dating anyway. And all right, so God was punishing us. Did I just tell you about this? This has nothing to do. Forget this. A friend of mine in the Jewish communities, their dear friend, an unmarried older man, actually legally married his dog.
That's so cute.
Did I tell you about this?
No.
Now you say, how did he legally marry? I don't know how he legally did it, but he actually had an officiating minister marry his dog and him. And he revealed this to my friends who were shocked. They didn't say anything about it, but they thought it was so strange because this man married his dog. Now, and the dog was a male, so I guess that's okay now. So, all right, so anyway, so I ran over your car, and you're the plaintiff. You're suing me. I'm the defendant. So, Curtis Wright, so the governments both put criminal penalties and civil penalties on Curtis Wright, the company, for violating the presidential declaration. And they lost in lower court. Curtis Wright won in lower court. And then the company, the U.S. government took it to the Supreme Court, and that's why the case is called U.S. v. Curtis Wright. The government was trying to overturn the lower court's decision. And why did the lower court find for Curtis Wright? The judge in the lower court held that what the Congress did when it passed the resolution delegated legislative authority to the president. Because if you read in Article 1, Section 8 of and I just talked about this in Alexander Hamilton today too, but you remember this from the Constitution? You also remember McCulloch v. Maryland?
Yes.
One of the powers given to Congress is the power to declare war. What does that mean, that Congress has the power to declare war?
That means that when they declare war, we can send troops to wherever they just declare war.
Well, it starts a situation of war, right?
Right.
And strictly speaking, if we declare, and by the way, for your information, of the 280 times that the United States has used military force in the world, only five of the wars that we've been in, of the 280 some military conflicts, have been declared wars. Anyway, so clearly, what does it mean to declare war? It means to set us at war, and then if Congress then declares the war over, we're at peace, right?
Yeah.
So the lower court judge said that what Congress did in passing this resolution was delegate legislative power to the president. Can you figure it out, or why? What's his reasoning? What did the resolution say?
The resolution Congress passed?
Yeah. Do you remember, what did the resolution say?
For him to do whatever he had to do to enforce it.
To enforce neutrality, right?
Yes.
So, in other words, you see the judge's reasoning.
Yes. I see it.
Because according to the judge, what did Congress do?
They gave the president the power to make laws, basically.
To declare war or not to, or sue for peace, right?
Yes.
Now, the president, by the Constitution in Article 2, is commander-in-chief. But that strictly means is that when a war is declared, then he commands the troops, right? But that means, according to the judge, the president himself can't set the nation at war or peace. Whose job is that?
Congress.
And therefore, Congress can't give the president that power. So do you all understand the issues in the case?
Yes.
So yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. What exactly was the constitutional question asked?
Did Congress, in the resolution authorizing the president to declare neutrality and enforce it, did the Congress unconstitutionally delegate legislative authority to the president by giving him the power to start and end a war? Now do you understand? Everyone understand that?
Yes.
Okay, good. Justice Sutherland wrote the opinion in the court, and he overturned the lower court decision and declared the resolution constitutional. Now, here is his reasoning. And if you're looking on page 3, let's read through his reasoning. Basically, here's Sutherland's answer if you're looking at the top of page 3. He said, this is not an unconstitutional delegation of power, where the Congress transferred legislative power to the president. Why? The resolution did not grant the president authority. He already had it. Now, as you're going to see, this is a very Hamiltonian reading of Article 2 in the Constitution. So let's take his reasoning apart, starting from the quote there. So again, his reasoning is the resolution actually didn't give the president any constitutional authority. He already had the authority to do it, which, if you think about it, means what's the practical consequence? You think he could have done it? He could have done it anyway. So the reason that the resolution was not unconstitutional, I just used two negatives, was because it was unnecessary. It didn't give the president any authority that he didn't already have. Now, this is a very sweeping interpretation. So let's pick it apart. So first he says, Sophie, if we read on the top, it results
that the investment of the federal government with the powers of external sovereignty did not depend upon the affirmative grants of the Constitution. The power to declare and wage war, to conclude peace, to make treaties, to maintain diplomatic relations with other sovereignties, if they have never been mentioned in the Constitution, would have vested in the federal government as necessary.
Concomitance means equipment of.
Concomitance of nationality. Neither the Constitution nor the laws passed in
pursuance of it
have any force in foreign territory unless in respect of our own citizens. As a member of the family of nations, the right and power of the United States in the field are equal to the right and power of other members of the international family. Otherwise, the United States is not completely sovereign.
Let me explain his reasoning. Now, Article 1, Section 8 defines the powers of Congress, right?
Mm.
What Sutherland is saying here, when it comes to foreign affairs, Article 1, Section 8 is not the source of the national government's power to engage in foreign affairs. It would have all those powers anyway as a sovereign government. In some ways, what he means is, when did the U.S. government acquire the power to engage in foreign affairs?
When they became their own nation.
Yep. Literally, as it says in the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We separated from Britain. We assumed our status among the powers of the earth. We became a sovereign nation. And the last paragraph of the Declaration actually says to engage in war and peace. So Sullivan says the Constitution is not even the source of the power in foreign affairs. We would have had it anyway. Now, then the question is, well, what is Article 1, Section 8 doing there? Why does it have to list the powers of the national government? And here's Sutherland's answer. This is also Hamilton's answer. The purpose of the enumeration is not to grant the United States the powers of a sovereign nation. It's to divide the powers of the national government from the states. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Do you understand what I just said?
Nope. Not really. Well, yeah, kind of, but I don't know.
Can you repeat it, Tammy? He's saying the purpose of Article 1, Section 8 is not to divide the powers of the Congress versus the president, or to give the national government the power to engage in foreign affairs. It would have had that anyway. The purpose was to divide the powers of the national government from the states as part of federalism. You can open the window if you want.
Okay, thank God.
And is the heat on? You can turn off the heat if you want.
I don't know. It's just hot in here.
No.
It's hot. Okay, you keep going.
Well, I have to tell you, those of you who are new to Converse, they have to, this just changed a little bit, but in the last 36 years, they have to turn all the heating on at the same time or turn it all off.
Where?
Because it was all connected to one system on campus. So typically we stifled in the fall and froze in the spring because they have to turn it all off at the same time. So anyway, so again, Hamilton, what Sutherland is saying is, the listing of Congress's powers isn't to divide legislative from executive authority. It's to divide national authority from state authority. In other words, it makes sure that the national government has all the powers to engage in foreign affairs so that the states don't. It's part of federalism. Does that make sense? So, and here Sutherland is very Hamiltonian. So if the national government always had the power to engage in foreign affairs, which branch of government naturally possesses that power? And that's why Lexi is going to read the second paragraph, which goes on to explain that the national government's inherent power to engage in foreign affairs belongs to what branch? And he answers it here. Go ahead.
The President is the constitutional representative of the United States with regard to foreign nations. He manages our concerns with foreign nations and must necessarily be most competent to determine when, how, and upon what subjects negotiation may be urged with the greatest prospect of success. For his conduct, he is responsible to the Constitution.
Haley, do you want to read the next part?
It is important to bear in mind that we are here dealing not alone with an authority vested in the President by exertion of legislative power, but with such an authority plus the very delicate
plenary means full or complete. Go ahead.
And exclusive power of the President as the sole organ of the federal government in the field of international relations. A power which does not require as a basis for its exercise an act of Congress, but which, of course, like every other governmental power, must be exercised in subordination to the applicable provisions of the Constitution.
So in common sense language, what Sutherland is saying is the reason that the resolution was not unconstitutional was because the president all along had the authority to determine neutrality. Because does the foreign government have the inherent power to engage in foreign affairs? And which branch has that power?
The president, the executive branch.
Because here's Hamilton and / Sutherland's reasoning. The essential power to engage in foreign affairs is an executive power. And therefore, when the Constitution says in the vesting clause in Article 2, that the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States, here's what Sutherland is saying it means. All of the power except those specific instances where the Constitution grants some power to Congress in foreign affairs belongs by nature to whom?
The president.
And therefore, according to Sutherland, the president could have done this without the resolution because the power to engage in foreign affairs is essentially executive. So in some ways, the resolution was constitutional because it was unnecessary. So if you mean, well, what was Congress doing according to Justice Sutherland? It wasn't authorizing the president to do what he already had the power to do. It was a resolution of support rather than authorization. Now, I have to tell you, as I put in bolded letters, which I'll read because it's bolded at the bottom, although there have been other important Supreme Court decisions and congressional actions that have limited or attempted to limit presidential discretion in foreign and military diplomatic affairs, Sutherland's opinion, which confirms Hamilton's interpretation of the presidency and Article 2 and the founding, seems to represent the modern consensus of the nation, that the president is the core of the direction of foreign affairs under the Constitution. And that confirms the kind of growth in scope and power of the presidency over time, because what nation, like it or not, is the most powerful nation in the world today? And therefore, if you follow Sutherland's reasoning, as the United States became a major foreign power, in fact, a superpower, in fact, the only superpower today, with some rivals coming on the horizon, what branch of government would that naturally favor in terms of authority and scope?
President.
And so there you have in this case the sense in which, in some ways, because of the change in the nation's character, the presidency is the center of foreign affairs and diplomatic issues. Now, the president has a few powers, like to recognize ambassadors, to make treaties with the Senate, and some other things. And in some ways, that shows how constitutional interpretation and historical development really have favored the size and scope and power of the presidency. Is that clear?
Yes.
Any questions about that? All right.
So you would say like today it's the same? Like, sorry.
No. I would say, like, for instance, take some issue like climate change. Where did President Biden go last week?
To the Pope.
First to the Pope.
Sweden?
Not Sweden.
Huh?
Glasgow.
What? Yeah, Glasgow. Where's Glasgow? And why? Right. So, the last major climate summit was when? The Paris. Thank you. The Paris Climate Agreement, which President Obama signed, not as a treaty, but as an executive agreement. What did President Trump do?
Undo it.
He backed out of it. Now, who got us into it?
Obama.
Who got us out of it?
Trump.
And by the way, what's Biden clearly intending to do?
Yes, back in.
Now, the question is, there is this constitutional question, can the president commit us to that much in foreign affairs without a treaty? There was another version of this, which it's another perfect example of the centrality of the presidency. President Obama negotiated what was called the Joint Agreement on Nuclear Weapons with Iran.
The Joint Agreement on
Nuclear weapons with Iran, in which Iran would limit its development of nuclear weapons in addition to for cash prizes and other things. One of the first acts that President Trump did was to
back out of it.
And in fact, to declare it null and void. Now, on one level, you could say, "Well, wait a minute. How could President Trump undo that agreement?" Because President Obama did not treat it as a treaty. He did not get 2/3 of the Senate. He did get a resolution of support for it. But strictly speaking, if you follow Sutherland, in some ways, President Obama had the authority to get us into it and to draft the agreement. But according to the same understanding, who could undo it? President Trump. So on one level, the Biden administration is trying to renegotiate the treaty. My whole point here is there are obviously limits on presidential power. But when it comes to foreign affairs and war, Sutherland's opinion seems to be the majority opinion of the nation, that this is essentially a presidential task. Yeah.
Okay, last question.
Yeah.
This is all I was trying to get at. So, you said there's been congressional actions that have limited it, or are you saying they just tried and it hasn't really worked?
Well, for instance, I'll give you an example, the outcome of which is actually still pretty ambiguous.
Mhm.
In 1973, President Nixon was president, and we were in the middle of the Vietnam War.
Mhm.
And where was the war going on?
Vietnam.
Here, President Nixon, because it's true that the supply lines of the Viet Cong, who were the communist rebels in Vietnam, actually, the North Vietnamese government was supplying the Vietnamese rebels through Cambodia, because Cambodia was in rebellion and it was in chaos and everything. And the North Vietnamese took the advantage of the chaos to circumvent the border of South Vietnam and to supply the Vietnamese rebels. President Nixon issued an order ordering U.S. troops to enter Cambodia and cut off the supply lines. Now, where was the war occurring?
In Vietnam.
And therefore, on one level, because Congress had passed a resolution supporting the war in Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which you may know about, but Cambodia is another country.
Right.
So what was a major criticism of Nixon at that point?
That he was overstepping
executive authority, not because if he had just contained U.S. troops in action in Vietnam, that's fine, he's commander-in-chief. But the argument was, by invading Cambodia to cut off North Vietnamese supply lines, what was he in effect doing?
Invading Cambodia as well.
Yeah, declaring war on
Cambodia.
Now, even though Cambodia was so impotent, it wasn't an issue. Now, in 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Act, which declared that Congress would have 60 days to overturn a presidential use of military authority. That's called the War Powers Act of 1973. Do you understand how it works?
So they have like 60 days to overturn.
So if Nixon had done what he did, what would Congress then? In other words, what would Congress do if it agreed with it?
They would just leave it alone.
Leave it alone. But if they disagreed with it, according to the War Powers Act,
they would vote to overturn it.
The Supreme Court has never decided on the constitutionality of this. But I have to tell you, every president since Nixon, which includes Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump, have declared the War Powers Act to be unconstitutional and that they would not obey it.
So is it still technically a law right now?
It is technically still on the books, but no acting president has ever agreed to abide by it.
How is it unconstitutional?
Because, so what's the argument for it being unconstitutional? Who's the commander-in-chief?
The president.
So the argument against the constitutionality of the War Powers Act is that it transfers military command from the president to the Congress.
But then if you sit there and you look at it and you say that if he entered into Cambodia, which is then technically declaring war on Cambodia, that's not his power, that's Congress's power, so then that's...
Have you ever heard the idea that there are two sides to every great question?
Yes.
So I have to say, I've been teaching constitutional law for 40 years. I've been studying it for almost 50 years. When it comes to all great constitutional questions, there typically are two legitimate versions. Now, you may have to decide on one or the other, but can you see the argument for both?
Yes.
So all I'm saying is that technically it's still a law on the books.
What do you think?
I agree that it's unconstitutional. And you want my specific argument?
Yeah.
I actually think, because the argument is, without this law, Congress, the president can use military power with no limits. Do you understand? And by the way, that's not a stupid argument. But here's my argument. Congress, nevertheless, can't tell the president how to use troops. That's the commander-in-chief power, correct? But what's Congress's constitutional power? If it really disagrees with a military action of the president, Congress has a full and complete constitutional power to stop it. What's that power?
Isn't it that 60 days?
No, I think the law is unconstitutional.
They have a power to stop presidential decisions.
Who makes what? Can I possibly render this question more unintelligible? According to the Constitution in Article 1, Section 9, all withdrawals from the Treasury have to be by law.
Oh, so they could stop him from getting the money.
There you go. If Congress really disagrees with a military action of the Congress, they can simply take away the
The right to get money out.
Does that make sense? Defund it.
Okay, so I see what you said. Well, I didn't even know that. I mean, I know it's supposed to done that.
Well, I presume you read the Constitution.
Yeah, but
no, but Sydney and everyone else, this is a serious question, and this shows why these constitutional questions aren't just abstract. They determine human lives. They determine human resources, and in some ways, was there ever a specific law authorizing the Afghanistan war? No. Where did the president get the authority to do it? In 2003, President Bush II went to Congress for the authorization for the use of military force against Iraq and other terrorists. So how did we introduce troops into Afghanistan and have a 20-year-old war?
I'll say there were other terrorists there.
And it was true, by the way. That's where, in fact, don't forget, I mean, that's where Al-Qaeda had rebased itself, and that's where it had gotten much of its training. So on one level, if Congress constitutionally wanted to stop the war in Afghanistan, it could have from the very beginning. How? Just to fund it. So I actually think the War Powers Act, which has never been tested into the Supreme Court, it's unnecessary and unconstitutional, which is, by the way, Nixon vetoed it, and then it was repassed over his veto. So I'm with the presidents on this. And I want you to know, both Democratic and Republican presidents have argued that it was unconstitutional. Now do you see the arguments for and against it?
Yes.
All right, we'll stop here and pick up on Friday.
It's so hot here. It's like death.
It's a complicated question.